This is a short film called Logan the Wolf, and in it we get to see what would have happened if characters like Wolverine or Magneto were around back in Viking times. But this got me thinking, what makes a fight scene not just good, but spectacular? You see, this premise of mutants in Viking times is incredibly creative and enticing, but what really blew me away about this short film was the fight scenes. They're some of the smoothest, best flowing action I've ever seen on screen, and I'm not exaggerating. This fight single-handedly blows every hand-to-hand combat scene in the MCU out of the water, and even some fights in movies like John Wick look less impressive after watching this short film. So it forced me to ponder the question, how did such a small group of people manage to pull off action scenes better than what we see from $100 million productions? What is the secret ingredient? When thinking about what makes a spectacular fight scene, the most common answer that comes to mind is good fight choreography, and this is what I thought as well. But in the process of making this video, I've come to realize just how much more depth there is when it comes to crafting the perfect fight. How many more equally important variables there are which people don't really seem to talk about. Variables we have to consider if we want that fight scene to be impactful and memorable. After rewatching Logan the Wolf around 7 to 8 times in a row, I think I've narrowed it down to 3 general points: flow, believability, and creativity. So let's start with the first point. What the heck do I mean by flow? What I mean when I talk about the flow of a fight scene is basically how it feels to watch and understand. Does each shot flow naturally into the next, creating a beautifully complex yet easily understandable fight, or does it feel jagged and rough around the edges? Does this fight scene feel like a smooth and polished pebble or a rough piece of quartz? And on top of that, which one of those is it trying to be? See, in one of my previous videos I talked about how John Wick has lots of these wide shots, with long takes allowing you to fully absorb what's happening on screen without 1,000 cuts blurring your vision, and Logan the Wolf very clearly has a similar style of cinematography. But even then, something about it feels different, because these fights are far more intense and fast-paced than what I'm used to seeing. So after multiple rewatches, it seems one of the tricks they used that I picked up on was the particular way they choreographed these fight scenes so that they work incredibly well with the cinematography. Creating a phenomenal fight scene requires far more than just actors who can fight, just like how creating the perfect team requires the right synergies and the proper heroes. You see, this video was made possible with the support of a game going through its 6th year anniversary, and my way of celebrating that was literally speedrunning the entire initial campaign of this game in one afternoon. I did it all with this badass and a dwarf I call Torbjorn, and by using this combo of lifesteal, damage resistance, and debuff removing healing, I can just quite literally sit there and tank the entirety of these bosses' damage without even breaking a sweat. But what's really crazy is the amount of stuff they're allowing me to give away for this event. To help you quickly cut through the grindy parts of the game, you can use my link below to speed through any of the game modes, whether they're the campaigns, dungeons, clan bosses, or arenas, with this epic hero Zargala, as well as not only $60 worth of additional items, but also any of these 4 legendary champions, all for free. And some of these champions they're giving away are like significantly better than even my best character. Not to mention, both new and existing players have access to these super powerful gift bundles, which can all be claimed using the promo codes in the description below. And with the seemingly endless amount of content, as well as the ridiculously active community this game has, there is still so much left to explore. So yeah, if you want to cut through the grindy segments like a hot knife through butter, as well as join my clan and game where I also go by Film Junkie, and speed through this game alongside me as I am still actively playing, then make sure to use the links below or scan the QR code on screen so you can get all these exclusive rewards as you give Raid Shadow Legends a try. But going back to my point about creating a good fight scene, every component of what is used to build that scene is equally important and should never be underestimated.
When you have this good stunt coordinator, maybe you cannot find a good stunt guy. When you find a good stunt guy, maybe the director, he don't know how to fight. When you find the director how to fight, the cameraman they don't know working.
It requires basically everyone working on that scene to be knowledgeable on that subject, and I think this is an example that demonstrates that beautifully. You'll see that while Logan the Wolf keeps your attention on the foreground, we have characters constantly weaving in and out of frame to exchange blows. This fast-paced, non-stop exchange of characters prevents the audience from ever wondering what the other 8 enemies are currently doing. For example, take a look at this scene from The Witcher. While this fight is definitely one of the best ones out of the entire series, you can't help but start wondering what these other dudes are doing as Henry Cavill takes them out one by one. And while there's nothing wrong with this fight, Logan the Wolf does something similar, but just on a whole nother level. Here we constantly have multiple enemies exchanging blows at all times, with each enemy doing a couple of attacks before weaving out of frame and allowing the next one to step in. And at times, when the choreography simply doesn't allow a character to step out of frame, well, they position themselves behind Logan in a way where you won't ever notice them unless you're like me and you've rewatched this fight 10 times. This synergy between what's physically happening and how the camera is being used is absolutely impeccable. But like I previously mentioned, we must remember to take into account what they were going for when making this fight. Logan the Wolf clearly went for the smooth pebble, as opposed to the jagged piece of quartz. A really brutal and bloody pebble, but a pebble nonetheless. Consistent, non-stop fluid action that uses these hidden transitions to take us from one long shot to the next without any sort of interruption. But this doesn't necessarily mean that action which decides to take a different route is bad. To explain what I'm talking about, we have to remember some of the constraints we're working with when creating these action scenes, to remember some of the reasons as to why we might choose a more jagged approach, so to speak. First thing we have to consider are the actors. How well can our actors fight? If you take a look at a film like John Wick, which had plenty of great action scenes, this still took Keanu spending thousands of hours training martial arts just so we can get this on screen. Not every actor is going to be able to do that for their role in a film, and in the case that they can't, well, that's when the team ends up having to compensate elsewhere.
When the camera angle movement, that means the actor, they don't know how to fight. The audience just very dizzy. And suddenly, boom, finished.
And while the last thing I want to do is make excuses for objectively bad fight scenes, we do have to remember that our actors are, after all, human. Chris Evans, for example, was able to pull off some fantastic moves in this fight against the Winter Soldier because of his background as a dancer. He has tons of experience with choreography and is already massively talented in that way. These mind-blowing fights in The Raid Redemption are also possible because some of the greatest martial artists in the film industry are working on this film. And so, while I absolutely do think it's a good thing for us to all strive for high standards when it comes to action, I can totally understand why not every fight we come across can look as crazy as this.
My friends were making fun of me. I was just kind of like walking around the house for a while, just sort of flipping this plastic knife. I mean, I was like driving in intersections and just flipping it in the car.
Aside from that, part of the flow in a fight scene is related to its tone. Are we going for a more grounded, brutal, and realistic fight like what we see in the film Nobody, where we can not only feel him get more tired, but also seriously hurt as the fight progresses? Or one where the character goes crazy and easily takes down every opponent in his way, like what you'd see with a superhero. Even the environment the fight takes place in can provide restrictions, like for example this elevator fight scene in Captain America: The Winter Soldier, containing much more blurry, shaky, and overall just zoomed in shots as opposed to some of the fights we see in other parts of the same film. And some of the reason as to why that is simply because in a tight environment like this, using a wide shot here would be difficult, because if you did, you'd probably end up seeing all the other 10 dudes stumbling around like idiots in the elevator while our main character is fighting for his life against just 4. There's a degree to which you do have to sacrifice some of that smoothness in order to create a fight that still makes sense on screen, and so in cases like this, I do think that it's acceptable. Now, you may have noticed that throughout some of the fights I've shown, despite going for much faster cuts and shakier camera movement as opposed to what we see in Logan the Wolf and John Wick, it still manages to maintain a degree of smoothness. I believe part of what allowed them to do that is how they utilized the characters' movements and framing to their advantage. These fights, in a way, keep their momentum as the action you see on screen is always guiding your eyes either towards the same point or at least in the same direction. For example, you'll notice that throughout this scene, the action and movement of the characters is constantly moving towards the left. When Bucky is shooting Cap, he's shooting from the left, while Steve is moving towards the left. When it cuts to the next shot of him reloading, he's still standing on the left. They continue fighting, and once again, Cap is blocking with a shield as he continues to move towards the left. Even after he gets knocked back, he's still rolling to the left. This preservation of momentum helps so much when transitioning between cuts, especially in a style like this where we see a lot more rapid editing. And to showcase this, I'll just make my own example. So here are two completely different shots from completely different movies with completely different color tones. If I were to just randomly cut to the other shot, it looks terrible, jagged, rough, and just doesn't have any flow whatsoever. But simply by matching the character's movement and preserving their momentum, it flows a lot more smoothly, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense. And so here's another example where your eyes are already focused on this part of the screen, and by allowing the momentum of these characters' actions to carry this transition, again, it feels a lot less jagged. And if you were to do this within the same movie, well, now it can feel almost seamless. So recognizing that these good fight scenes require basically every element of that film production to work together in this fantastical way makes me appreciate something like this just that much more. But this leads me to my next point, which is believability. Everything mentioned beforehand doesn't really work well unless the audience is able to believe what they're seeing on screen. In my John Wick video, I covered how they used the characters in that story to tell us the legend of John Wick and really bring it to life, making it easier to believe that this character is actually able to pull off so many crazy feats.
He was the one you sent to kill the fucking boogeyman.
Today, I'd like to focus on two other aspects of what makes all this craziness more believable. One of them is the inclusion of these little bits of realism, and the other is their ability to assign the right level of competence to our characters and their enemies. So first, what do I mean by these little bits of realism? Most good action scenes have a certain level of depth to them, and one of the results of having that depth is you'll often notice these little details that, while unnecessary, do help to elevate that fight's believability. For example, look at this fight in John Wick 3, where they're throwing knives at each other. You'll notice that not every knife manages to stick, just like in real life, depending on the distance thrown, the movement of the target, and the technique you use to throw that knife, there's just so much room for inconsistency. And that's exactly what we see here. Sometimes it's these little details, like how John shoots his doctor before he even finishes his sentence.
Just below my floating rib, be sure not to hit my...
This makes sense because considering John Wick is a legend among legends in terms of killing, he probably knows every part of the human body by heart, and so he knows exactly where to shoot for a fatal or non-fatal wound. The result, he doesn't have to wait for the doc to finish before he demonstrates both his excellent shooting skills and his knowledgeability about the human body. Or this scene where he stabs a guy in the head and the knife gets stuck, since that's how hard a skull is. I really do believe that these details, while small, have a massive impact on how that fight is perceived, and noticing them simply elevates that experience. And for the next point, competent enemies. It's important to have enemies who aren't just punching bags, who don't just fall over the moment they fight the main character. The enemies our characters fight should be as skilled as they're supposed to be. This is a quality basically every good action film or action scene has, including Logan the Wolf. life.
Et ce que je voulais aussi pour les méchants, c'était d'avoir des gens qui sont quand même bons en fait. J'avais l'impression de sentir que c'est pas des gars qui arrivent et qui prennent un coup et qui meurent. J'ai envie qu'il y ait des échanges, qu'il y ait des coups qu'ils réussissent à lui mettre.
In this setting, Wolverine's claws are still made of bone, and so we have this incredible scene where the enemies target his claws instead of continuing to attack his body, as they realize he's just gonna keep healing and it doesn't actually do anything. These are clearly experienced soldiers who seem to have been together for a while, so this level of coordination and strategy is expected. Likewise, this version of Wolverine is said to have fought many battles in the past.
Stories are told about a ferocious war that butchers women and children, and even slaughtered 20 of Gunna's men alone.
And he's probably had to hide his true identity as a mutant, so it makes sense that he's skilled with a blade and is able to take at least a couple men down before he actually gets hit and later has to rely on his claws. Wolverine here isn't completely overpowered. Of course, he's fantastic at fighting, but that's probably because he doesn't age and he's likely been in far more battles than any of these other characters have. But at the same time, these soldiers are just about as good as fighting as you'd expect them to be, dishing out lethal blows and overwhelming Wolverine time and time again, only for him to survive just because of his healing factor. That's pretty darn realistic. The Raid Redemption, what's regarded as one of the best action movies of all time, has very competent enemies. The enemies are said to have combat experience despite being drug addicts and thugs.
Perhatian, yang kita hadapin ini orang-orang yang sudah terlatih, yang sudah siap perang.
And they're all organized and loyal to this boss. And so, once again, you'd expect a certain level of coordination, strategy, and combative skill. And that's exactly what we get. From the moment these criminals are alerted of the SWAT team entering their building, we see snipers set up in adjacent buildings, taking weapons that were already left there in advance and using them to eliminate the SWAT members posted outside. We see thugs take out the SWAT team's only mode of transport, leaving them with no easy way to escape. We see the lights get turned off, giving the enemies an advantage since they know the building's layout, but not the officers. In this situation, all it takes is one simple mistake and it all goes to hell. And of course, that's exactly what happens. During chases, we'll see the enemy utilize their knowledge of the environment to their advantage. We'll see them change strategies when something isn't working. And the same goes for our protagonists. They're as competent as you'd expect them to be, immediately looking for a separate way out, coming up with strategies on the fly, and of course, excelling in close combat. Astartes, yet another masterpiece of a short film, again has very competent enemies. They employ all the right strategies, time and time again utilizing the ship's layout to set up traps and ambushes, and overall just making very tactically sound decisions. It's in moments like these where our characters fight actual people instead of dummies who just act as punching bags before falling over that the fight feels engaging, impactful, and realistic. Good action demands that characters don't win fights simply because their enemies were intentionally made worse than they're supposed to be. That's called plot armor. If you want your character to win, then we need to see them fight and act just that much fucking better. So now it's time to address the last point on this list, which is creativity. I know I've spent a good portion of this video praising the action in this short film already, but there are other things that I did appreciate. This premise of mutants back in Viking times is just so enticing to me. Seeing Wolverine walk around thinking he's superior to other people because he can't die.
No man walking these lands can slay me. What would I be doing with you?
And seeing the director of this film specifically saying that that's exactly what they went for. I think there's so much potential here, and that level of creativity in executing this idea is a huge part in what made me interested in the first place. If this was just random dudes fighting in the woods somewhere, this fight scene wouldn't have ever gotten so popular. But because they managed to take an already elite level of action choreography and put a highly creative twist on it, that is why this short film ended up being so legendary. And here, once again, I have to bring up another personal favorite example, which also takes a concept and puts a creative twist on it, and that is Upgrade. For this example, I'll have to give some context, but don't worry, I won't spoil anything. In this film, our main character, Gray, is a paraplegic and had an AI chip called STEM implanted into his neck in order to regain control over his body. The thing is, given Gray's permission, the chip can act on its own, and since it's a super intelligent AI, well, it can do stuff like this.
It's good to be back, Gray.
And here's the part where it gets creative. Since STEM can only control everything below the neck, notice how Gray's head acts during this fight. His head is effectively separate from his body, and you'll notice these tiny details of how STEM will move his head out of the way with Gray's hands or do these strange jerking motions with his entire body in order to dodge attacks aimed at Gray's head. Because of course, STEM doesn't have control over that part. It doesn't make sense for a super intelligent AI to make inoptimal movements like this in order to dodge an attack. But since it doesn't have control over the neck and head, not only does it now make complete sense, but it also turns this into a perfect opportunity for more creativity. And here I have to compliment Logan's incredible acting. Yes, his name is Logan, because it seriously feels like I'm watching someone who's spectating as his body moves on its own. And throughout the rest of the film, this stays impressively consistent. I believe this is also a great example of how interconnected creativity and believability are. This creative form of fighting wouldn't work unless the viewer truly believed what they're seeing, that a paralyzed man is simply spectating as his body does the fighting. But here's a final point I didn't previously mention, and that's how these examples dealt with emotion. I believe a good fight scene also needs to make you feel a certain way. Emotion plays a big role in making each of these fights not just more impactful, but also memorable. There's a quote from Maya Angelou I'd like to reference. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think that's why there are some fights you'll always remember, whether it's something that's sincere and heartbreaking,
Is this what you want from me?
or something so overly badass you can't help but grin at. It's what you feel at that moment which takes that experience and turns it into a lasting memory. The stronger the emotion, the stronger the memory. And I hope that one day my videos will make you feel something too. Cheers.